Would you ask Dr. Crowder to come back in, please? Thank you. Right, Dr. Crowder, you ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Crowder. Let's look at your third witness statement. I'm just going to finish off on the Lakanal topic now. If we go to your third witness statement at page 55, paragraph 219, please. So that's BRE 3047668. So at paragraph 219, you say this. You say, while I do not agree with Professor Bisbee's report concerning the Lakanal House fire investigation, I am in total agreement with him that more should have been done to learn the lessons from the fire, although I consider that this ought to have been on the full range of issues and not just cladding. Now, focusing on the cladding and the external wall for a moment and leaving aside all the other matters, and I know there were many that arose from the Lakanal House fire, what more do you consider should have been done to learn the lessons from the fire?
In relation to, well, it cuts across everything, really. But the clarification of the guidance, it became clear, particularly during the inquest, that it was possible to hold different views as to what the guidance meant, and there was a need to ensure that the clarity existed so that there would be a common understanding among industry as to what needed to be done, that would then result in the functional requirements being met.
And by the guidance, you're talking about the guidance in approved document B, are you?
Yes.
And in what respect, where you say it became clear that there was this lack of clarity, can you be more specific? In what areas did you come away from that inquest thinking, that's clear, that's unclear, that's unclear, that's unclear? Were there multiple areas or just one?
So it was in relation to external walls. There was this sort of, what's the word? I'll use the word conflation, there's a better word, but about how the external wall fulfills these interrelated functions around limiting fire spread across the face of the building, limiting fire spread between buildings, not compromising the compartmentation scheme, and yes, making sure that there was clarity around that.
I see. So are you talking about clarity about the difference between fire resistance and reaction to fire?
That was one of the elements of that, yes.
Yeah. What were the other elements of ADB that required clarity after the Lakanal fire?
How do I put this? I suppose that the way in which the build-up as a whole, so there are the individual test standards that are referred to in relation to whether it's the surface or the underlying construction and so on, but the guidance didn't really address how different forms of wall build-up. In reality, when you're looking at a wall system, depending upon the makeup of the wall, aspects of performance for individual components differ. So it might become very important for one component to have a level of performance, but less important for another component. You might pick on, say, a rain screen, for example, as opposed to a curtain wall. And that, there isn't a great level of detail, particularly within Section 12 of ADB, as is now, so Section 13 for Lakanal House. But it's not broken down in the same way that, say, the other sections are, where we have fairly explicit guidance around, say, lengths of corridors and the specific types of alarm system that you need to provide in buildings to ensure that people are alerted. It's a fairly broad brush set of guidance in relation to external wall construction.
Right, I see. So were those the particular lessons you came away with? After
in relation to
Lakanal?
cladding, yes.
I see. And who did you think specifically should have done more about those issues?
Government.
Right. Now, I want to turn to a different topic now. This is some research that you carried out with others at the BRE in 2014 and 2015 concerning external fire spread, which you addressed in detail in your second witness statement to the inquiry. Now, if we turn first to BRE 30433751, so this is a report, it's called Investigation of Real Fires, External Fire Spread in Multi-Storey Buildings. You can see that as the title. Do you see that on the right-hand side?
Yes.
And it was prepared for Brian Martin. It's dated the 9th of January 2014. We see that in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yes.
Now, is it right that, in effect, the research set out in this report was carried out with some funds which had already been allocated to the Investigation of Real Fires project for that year and were left over? Is that correct?
Yes.
Right, we'll come back to that. And we can see from page 1 the date, and at page 2 we can see that the report was prepared for Brian Martin by a number of you, including you, Nathan Cole, Ciara Holland and Martin Shipp, yes?
Yes.
And it was approved by Dr. Debbie Smith on the 14th of January 2014, yes?
Yes.
Now, should that date, can you help us with this, and the date on the front page actually read 2015? Or is that an error? I ask because in your second witness statement for the transcript, this is page 34, paragraph 108, you explain that this work arose following a telephone call to you from Ronnie King of the All-Party Parliamentary Fire Safety Group in July 2014. Now, is it possible that this report, therefore, that there's an error and this should have read 2015?
Probably yes, and I note the copyright notice at the bottom says 2015 as well.
Yes, yes. So we think it's probably 2015 and
Agreed.
someone's just carried over the wrong date. Now, if we can look at your second witness statement, BRE 3043716, page 33, paragraph 104, you explain that the documents that are listed in some bullet points above that, so at paragraph 9, you were asked by the inquiry understands that you co-authored 2 reports commissioned by MHCLG, both dated April 2016, entitled External Fire Spread Part 1 Background and Research, External Fire Spread Part 2 Experimental Research, yes?
Yes.
And you tell us in paragraph 104, you say, please note that these are not reports, they're articles, the second of which was produced following the production of a research report, yes?
Yes.
Now, just so we have the order of this correct, is it right that after the report we just looked at, the first page of it, was submitted to the department in January 2015, the 2 articles here were produced, is that correct?
Yes.
Let's go to that part 1 article, the background and research one. That's CLG 3019445. And we can see from page 1 that you are one of the authors, together with Ciara Holland and Martin Shipp, yes?
Yes.
And if we look at page 2, we can see that this is dated in the top, very top right-hand corner. Sorry, we've just lost it. In grey, we see it's dated the April 2016.
Yes.
And then if we just orientate ourselves briefly on the part 2 article, the experimental research article, this is at CLG 3019444. Do you have that?
Yes.
And then, again, we can see you're an author, together with Ciara Holland, Martin Shipp and Nathan Cole. And on page 2, again, we can see it's dated April 2016. So they were both finalised over a year after the research report was submitted to the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you help us? What was the reason for that delay between that first report and then these articles?
I've a feeling, and I don't know if it's covered in my statement, I've got a feeling they were spent a long time with Debbie Smith, who would tend to be involved in approving articles. There may have also been a delay in identifying journals, publications that were prepared to take them on.
Right. And help us, you pointed out, as we saw in your second statement, that these were articles rather than research reports. What difference did that make in terms of the content of them? Did that make any difference?
Articles are generally restricted by the publication in terms of word count, so you end up having to try and fit, sometimes shoehorn the information into a smaller number of words than you'd like.
Yes, I see. And did the Part 2 article, which covered the experimental research reported originally in January 2015, did that contain any information or reach any different conclusions from the information provided or the conclusions reached in the research report?
Sorry, I may have misheard you. You just say, is there a difference between the articles and the report? Is that the question? I think the reports contained a bit more granular detail as to what was done and why. I don't think the findings did not fundamentally change.
Yeah. Were these two articles published and placed into the public domain? Can you help us with that?
Yes, I believe so. I cannot recall where. It's probably listed somewhere.
Okay. Now, if we go within your second statement at page 34, paragraph 106, you explain in the first few lines, I believe the very first discussions regarding the possibility of conducting a piece of work dealing with these issues occurred around the time of the inquest at Lakanal, yes?
Yes.
Now, who did those discussions take place between?
I think myself and Brian Martin after that, so that third and final day of my evidence, and after probably his evidence as well, actually. There was an initial discussion then.
And was that in March 2013?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you tell us what was discussed at that stage about this work?
Nothing in detail. It was just that if this becomes an issue, you know, this confusion around what are the relevant requirements, then it might need to be addressed.
I see.
It wasn't much more than a passing remark, but that was the very earliest that I could recall this sort of topic having arisen.
Yeah. And can we be clear, the confusion you're talking about, is that about whether or not external walls need to be fire resisting as well as having a reaction to fire performance?
Yes, for the purpose of spread across the external wall.
Yeah.
Setting aside space separation.
Yeah. And if we look at paragraph 108 below that, you explain this. You say at the beginning of that paragraph, the issue resurfaced on the 4th of July 2014 when I was contacted by Ronnie King by telephone regarding a presentation he wanted me to give to the all-party Parliamentary Fire Safety and Rescue Group. And you say, I immediately emailed Debbie Smith following the call and provide this email and Debbie Smith's response as one of your exhibits, yes. Now let's go to that email. It's at BRE 3043752. And looking at that second email in the chain, sent by you to Debbie Smith on the 4th of July 2014 at 11:33, subject is Ronnie King. You say, hi Debbie, I've just had a phone call from Ronnie. Apparently he and others are pushing DCLG on the next ADB following Lakanal. There are two issues, external fire spread and cladding. You can guess the sprinkler argument, though it's interesting to note apparently DCLG have said they won't consider research they didn't pay for, given how little they're commissioning. On the external fire spread issue, they want to use Lakanal to push for FD30 spandrel panels based on my evidence. I said to him I couldn't see a case for UK-wide change based on one incident, but could understand the need for it to be properly followed up to quantify the variables, etc. One thought that occurred to me was adapting the cladding rig to look at window and spandrel panel assembly in a generic way with an established standard fire, which could be a nice project for us, ... Anyway, Ronnie wants me to attend a meeting at the Houses of Parliament on the 22nd of July, which I need to check with LFB given the prosecution. Could we discuss on Monday, please? Now, you say in the first paragraph there that there were two issues arising from your call with Ronnie King, external fire spread and cladding. And you go on to give some detailed comments on the external fire spread matter, which we will come on to. What was it that Ronnie King mentioned to you in relation specifically to cladding? I think there's I've
mistyped in this email. I think the two issues were sprinklers and cladding, or sprinklers and external wall construction.
I see.
As soon as it popped up on screen, I realised there's a mistake there, because external fire spread and cladding amount to the same thing. I almost certainly meant sprinklers and external fire spread or cladding.
Yeah, I see. And focusing on that paragraph on sprinklers, you say there, it's interesting to note, apparently GCLG have said they won't consider research they didn't pay for. Do you know who at the department had said that to Ronnie King?
I can't recall. He probably did tell me. It's not impossible. It may well have been Brian Martin, but I honestly can't recall.
Okay. And was that about research on sprinklers, which had been commissioned by the Chief Fire Officers Association?
It may have been, although Ronnie was also involved with the National Fire Sprinkler Network, and I think they might have commissioned some research. There was also the Business Sprinkler Alliance, which at the time I believe was conducting research. There were various pieces of work that were going on around that time, around what types of buildings ought to be provided sprinklers.
Yeah. And why was it interesting for you to note in this email that DCLG had said they won't consider research they didn't pay for? You say specifically it was interesting.
That's me trying to be diplomatic, expressing my frustration that clearly DCLG aren't listening to anyone in terms of research that others are going to the trouble of paying for, given DCLG themselves aren't commissioning any research. If you're neither going to commission research nor read up on someone else's, it doesn't bode very well.
Yeah. Did you think that was a reasonable position for the department to be taking at this time?
No, but that was the situation at the time.
Now, focusing now on the third paragraph, just help us. There's a reference there to FD30 spandrel panels. Does that mean panels resisting fire for 30 minutes?
Yes, that should probably have been FR30 rather than FD30.
Right,
yes.
Thank you. And by my evidence, do you mean the evidence you gave to the coroner at the Lakanal inquest?
Yes.
And in terms of your comment to Ronnie King that you couldn't see a case for UK-wide change based on one incident, can you just explain briefly what you meant by that?
So I think Ronnie made the point, Mr. King made the point that, the inquest had happened and he felt that there flowed from it a need to amend the guidance in this way. And I remained of the opinion that I'd expressed in terms of the separation of the two. But I could see the merit in doing a piece of work and seeing if outside of the bounds of Lakanal there might be a case for making a change.
Right. So it was that you considered needed to be properly followed up, yes?
Yes.
Before this call from Ronnie King on the 4th of July 2014, had you ever suggested to Brian Martin or any other official from the department that this matter needed to be properly followed up?
No, there was just the exchange immediately at the end of the inquest.
Now, if we can turn to BRE 3043756, this is an email from Mr. King to you 3 days later on the 7th of July 2014. So, as we know, he invited you to a meeting of the all-party parliamentary group in order to, in paragraph 1, he wanted you to give some clarification. So he said, further to our conversation, the group would be pleased if you could attend at the next meeting. And then in the third line, he says, to give some clarification on the issue which we discussed relating to the spandrel panels under the windows of flat 79 at Lakanal House, having only a surface spread of flame classification rather than a degree of fire resistance, as was required at the time of a previous fire at Lakanal House, before the windows and panels had been replaced, yes?
Yes.
And in the final paragraph on page 1, he says this: meanwhile, could you please let me know if you have any further information on the possibility of any tests which might be able to be undertaken and which could be used to confirm that a Class 0 surface spread of flame would not have made any significant difference to the speed at which the fire entered Catherine Hickman's flat when compared to the fire resistance classification previously required under Section 20 of the London Building Act. Yes?
Yes, I see that.
So he's saying quite specifically that he'd like to understand what difference the Class 0 surface spread of flame would have made. Yes?
Well, he's looking for a better understanding of the difference between a Class O panel versus a fire-resisting panel.
Yes. And then if we turn to BRE 30043758, there's a long chain of emails here between Martin Shipp and Ronnie King on this subject, into which you were copied on the 21st of July 2014. We can see, for example, from the top email that you're copied in. We're not going to go through the whole of this chain, but I want to just look at some of it. If we could go to page 8, on the second paragraph down, this is in Ronnie King's email. He writes, the all-party group has asked CLG Minister with responsibility for the building regulations, Stephen Williams MP, if he will take immediate steps to correct the obvious weakness in the current approved document B, insofar as the requirement for the spandrel panels under the windows of flat 79 at Lakanal House, needing only to have a surface spread of flame classification, rather than a degree of fire resistance, as was required at the time of a previous fire at Lakanal House before the windows and panels had been replaced. Yes?
Yes.
And we can see from the third paragraph down of this email that he's concerned that your evidence at the inquest into the deaths at Lakanal House was that the panels burned through within 4.5 minutes, and he wanted to know for certain whether your evidence that Class 0 panels would have made a difference was correct. So he says, firstly, David's report to the coroner's inquest confirmed that the spandrel panels underneath the bedroom windows of flat 79 at Lakanal House burned through within 4.5 minutes, having no fire resistance and only Class 3 surface spread of flame. At the inquest, he gave an opinion that at a previous fire at Lakanal House, before the windows and panels had been replaced, that it is highly likely that these panels were able to survive a fully flashed over fire for some time, possibly 30 minutes or more. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, moving up to page 3 of this long chain, in the first full paragraph of this email, starting right down in line 7, it's actually 4 lines up from the bottom, there's a semicolon, and it begins, he says, so we are no clearer now whether panels to a Class 0 surface spread of flame, as specified in the regs, would have prevented that fire spread so rapidly. I believe it would have made very little difference to the speed at which the fire entered Catherine's flat. Do you see that?
Yes.
So he's very clearly making the point that if there'd been Class 0 panels as recommended by approved document B, he doesn't think it would have made any difference. Yes?
Agreed, yes.
And therefore, he's concerned that the guidance given in approved document B is ineffective, yes?
Yes.
And then if we go down to the second paragraph on page 5, it's the paragraph in blue just above the red text. He says, for example, there are 4,000 other older tower blocks in the country, potentially needing to undertake building works involving the outside walls, window sets and panels under the guidance of the approved document. Would this not be sufficient evidence for action to be taken now rather than wait until 2017? Do you see that?
Yes.
What were your views on that kind of sentiment at the time? There's many buildings that are going to undergo refurbishment. We need to act now to change the approved document rather than wait until 2017.
Oh, I'm in agreement that the approved document needed to be updated because, the more time passes with outdated guidance in effect, the more risk there is that things will be done to that guidance which aren't done to a higher standard.
Yes, and I think you told us yesterday that for a long time, certainly from, I think you said 2008 onwards, you did have concerns that Class Naught was far from ideal, yes?
Yes.
Had you met Ronnie King before or during the Lakanal inquest?
I'm not sure I'd met him before the inquest. I did meet him at the inquest.
Had you discussed Ronnie King and his views with Brian Martin at any stage?
Yes, at one point or two. I mean, Ronnie King was, again, he was very strongly associated with the sprinkler industry prior to his tenure at the All-Party Parliamentary Group. And so I know that Ronnie had been involved in lobbying government in relation to sprinklers. That's probably about the extent of it, though. I've known of him for a very long time in relation to sprinklers.
Yeah. So are you saying that you did discuss Ronnie King's views about sprinklers with Brian Martin?
Yes, not at length, but yes,
Right.
I would have done.
And in a nutshell, what were Brian Martin's views about what Ronnie King was saying about sprinklers?
That Ronnie King was part of the sprinkler establishment that wanted to get sprinklers into as many buildings as possible, and what's the word I'm looking for? Government would, and I think they did on various occasions, conduct these sort of regulatory impact assessments, and the point that was made to me was, ultimately the sums don't stack up in terms of the value to UK PLC of broadening the scope of sprinkler use.
Okay. Did you get the impression that Mr. Martin was listening to Ronnie King's arguments on sprinklers?
My impression was yes, but I think he'd sort of grown tired. I think Brian Martin felt he was sort of piggy in the middle. He was always on the receiving end of these approaches about increasing sprinkler coverage, but was ultimately always going to end up providing the same answer in return on behalf of government.
Did you ever discuss with Brian Martin Mr. King's concerns about external fire spread, Class Naught, fire resistance, cladding? Did you ever have that discussion with Mr. Martin?
I don't think so. I mean, I kept at arm's length from these discussions from fairly early on, albeit that I did obviously become involved again with the experiments later. But because of my involvement in the fire safety prosecution, I kept arm's length from this.
Can we agree, though, that the research and experiments that you went on to conduct for Brian Martin in 2014 and 2015, following this exchange of correspondence, were undertaken in part to provide an answer to Ronnie King's concerns?
Yes.
Can we agree that they were undertaken to appease Ronnie King and any others who were or might have been seeking to challenge the retention of Class Naught as a metric for the fire performance of the external surfaces of high-rise buildings?
No, because I don't think Ronnie King was challenging the retention of Class Naught. He was challenging not reintroducing fire resistance.
But he's clearly querying the value of having Class Naught, which he describes as a surface spread of flame test, as the relevant performance metric, isn't he? He may be saying, and I want fire resistance instead, but there's a first part to his argument, which is Class Naught's flawed, yes?
No, I don't. That's not my interpretation of what he was writing. He said, we have a reaction to fire performance metric here, which is doing a job, but we also need a fire resistance metric to do another part of the job. But he wasn't saying that Class Naught is an inadequate performance metric in relation to reaction to fire.
Well, we've read his emails. I'm not going to go back over them. Let's turn to your witness statement, your third witness statement at BRE 3047668 and page 47, paragraph 186. So this is your most recent statement. And in this statement, you say, I accept the work carried out for the external fire spread reports was flawed. However, the work, I believe, should be seen in the context of the extremely limited resources in terms of budget, people and time that were available for the team to complete it. Now, before we go on to some more detailed questions about this work, can you just tell us in your own words why you're saying in this latest statement that you accept the work was flawed?
Because with appropriate resources, a better piece of work could have been carried out. Everything I set out in the second witness statement amounted to the same statement, and I was providing because this third statement was largely in response to Professor Bisbee's report. So this was a short, more succinct response to the relevant section of his report.
Yes, we don't see any such statement in your second statement. I'm seeking to understand from you now in what way you're saying that the work carried out for the external fire spread reports was flawed. What do you mean by that?
In that they were a basic set of experiments that were conducted using basic materials, homogeneous materials. We didn't have the opportunity to consider composite materials, for instance. And there wasn't the time available, apart from anything else, to give the work, particularly the research work, the attention that it ought to have had.
And is that a view you had at the time you were doing the work, that it was flawed in that way?
To be honest, I don't think we had time to stop and think about it at the time. It was the need arose as a result of discussions set out in this, and then the work was priced up in a proposal. We had to figure out what we actually had left to work with in terms of budget, and then it was approved, and then we realised, as in my team realised, that we only had a very narrow window of opportunity to get the work done within the financial year, which was another constraint. But the point being that the cladding walls were fully booked on the standard testing work until the end of the financial year. We had a week to work with, and we just got it done. I would not say it was a piece of work that we had a lot of time to reflect on,
right,
either before or during.
So can you help us? When was it that you appreciated that this work was flawed? When did you come to that realisation? Most acutely post-Grenfell, because I've seen the sort of the various ways that it's been not misconstrued, unfair, but people have sort of drawn different conclusions from it, because the work, for various reasons, it wasn't a complete piece of work. Equally, we weren't able to fully contextualise the background to the work, so people have read into the research sort of different intentions and findings, which aren't accurate, but that, again, those are due to limitations that were imposed on the work. When you say people have sort of drawn different conclusions from it, help us with that. What do you mean by that? Which people and what conclusions have they drawn?
Sorry, I struggled. On social media and in news articles post-Grenfell, I've seen various opinions. I'm afraid I can't name names off the top of my head, but there have been inferences drawn, for instance, that it was about, for instance, the retention of Class O, whereas in fact the whole purpose of the piece of work was this question whether to add fire resistance or not. And both the Class O and the timber panels that we used in the experiment were essentially the baseline benchmarks to see what the different outcomes might be.
Right.
But that wasn't properly explained because, particularly in terms of the research, we were specifically, I was, because of my role within the Lakanal prosecution, instructed not to make reference back to Lakanal, which was the source of the entire exercise.
I see. And can you help us with this? Why don't we see anywhere in your second statement any statement like this that we see in your third statement, that the work carried out in these reports was flawed?
I mean, well, the simple answer is that, there wasn't a question. My second statement was a responsive statement. So I answered all the questions, including, setting out various flaws. They are set out within that statement, but there wasn't a point within that statement as a responsive statement for me to make these overarching points. So this was one of the reasons why I felt it's appropriate for me to prepare and submit this voluntary third statement, was to try and set my position out in my own words, in a what's the word I'm looking for? Just in an open-ended way rather than in responsible.
Yes, I see. Because as we read your second statement, we didn't read you as accepting that there were flaws in it, but let's leave that for the moment. When you did realise that this work was flawed, did you immediately contact the department for whom the research had been submitted?
Probably not, no, because they were dealing with the Post-Grenfell response, and I was dealing with the Met Police investigation by then, and I really wasn't in contact with the department because of being full-time within Grenfell Tower itself.
Have you at any stage sought to correct any flaws in the work as far as possible?
No.
I asked you the question before, when did you realise, when you realised the work was flawed, did you immediately contact the department for whom the research had been submitted? And you said, probably not, no. Isn't it a yes or a no? Did you contact the department and say, this work is flawed?
The reason I say probably not is to say an awful lot happened post-Grenfell would be an understatement. My recollection of the early days and weeks after the Grenfell fire is not brilliant at this point, given how much stress was involved at that time. I remember being called by Brian Martin, I think it was, about, attending there was a first meeting, I think, that was to be held on the Saturday, which I think was the precursor to the expert panel and so on, and having to work out where I stood in relation to everything, and ultimately realising that my role was going to be within the Met investigation. Hence why I say probably.
I see.
It's not impossible that I did, but even if I did, it wouldn't have been much more than a passing comment because of how much was going on at that time.
I see. But subsequent to that, I mean, obviously that was an intensive time in the aftermath of the fire, but I mean, in the years since the fire, have you thought to contact the department and inform them of your view that the work was flawed?
I think we've had that conversation. I haven't formally contacted them, but that conversation has been had. Between
who? Between you and who?
Almost certainly Brian Martin, I would think.
Right. So you think you've had a conversation with him in which, you've both agreed that the work was flawed?
Yes. It goes back to the point I made, I think it was yesterday, of trying to do the best that you can, but with very limited resources, and I think, it's for him to say ultimately. I think he recognises that as well, but that we've had those conversations about what was trying to be achieved pre-Grenfell and where we've ended up.
And what was his response? Did he already appreciate it was flawed, or was he surprised to hear that was your conclusion now?
I don't think he was surprised, no.
Has anyone ever sought to withdraw the articles and the research report?
I don't know.
Presumably you were aware that the department would continue to rely on it unless informed by the authors that it was flawed, yes?
I suppose so. I mean, I don't think the department had much intention of relying on it, to be honest, but I take the point.
Well, let's look at Brian Martin's witness statement to this inquiry. If we can go to CLG 3019469 at page 50 and look at paragraph 141. He says this: in April 2016, I received the results of some research I had commissioned BRE to undertake on the concerns regarding fire spread over the external walls of multi-storey buildings. I had commissioned this research in November 2014 to address the issues that had been raised previously by the AAPPG in their letter of the 5th of August 2014. The findings were that There is a clear, demonstrable need to ensure that buildings are designed and constructed so that fire spread across the external face and within the external facade is inhibited, as required by the building regulations. There is adequate guidance available in the public domain to allow this to be achieved. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then he goes on, he says at paragraph 142 below that, on the basis of this BRE research, I was satisfied that not only did the building regulations adequately cater for external fire spread, but also that there was adequate guidance available in the public domain. The BRE research was then published in 2 parts, the April-May editions of the Building Engineer magazine, the Journal of CABE. This is another publication that is read widely across the industry. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, it will be a matter for Mr. Martin to be asked about this, and we will be asking him about this. But he's clearly relying on this research in his statement to the inquiry, and there's no acknowledgement that it's flawed. Do you understand that that's a recent revelation that Mr. Martin has come to? Or have you understood him to have that view for a long time?
I understand he's had, well, it's not in the last 6 months, let's say, that he's had the view, or that he's come to the view. Yeah, he may well have been satisfied at the time the research was provided to him, but I believe his view has changed since then.
I see. And that's based on oral conversations you've had with him?
Yes.
Yes. Now let's look at the Part 1 article in more detail. This is at CLG 3019445. Now this is the background and research article, and then we saw there was a separate article that we'll come to, which is writing up the experimental tests, yeah?
Yes.
So this was background and research prior to that. Now, what aspects of this particular work do you consider to be flawed? Any of it?
I don't have as many concerns about it. Well, I'm not sure I'd have any specific concerns about this, although I wasn't hugely involved in its drafting. My concern around the flaws are more in relation to the experiments.
Right, yeah. Let's go to page 2. There's a section headed Scope in the middle of the page. And we read at the beginning of that section, it says, Part B, Section 12 of Approved Document B, Volume 2, is concerned with the construction of external walls of buildings. The aim of this article is to clarify the background to these recommendations, their objectives and intended outcomes. The requirement of Part B, Schedule 1 of the building regulations is as follows, and then you set out the functional requirement in B4. So that was the aim, yes, to clarify the background to the recommendations in Section 12 of ADB. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you consider now that the article achieved that aim?
To an extent, yes, it did. Whether it, well, I don't think it addressed every aspect of it, but it provided a degree of clarification to the background to
Right.
the functional requirement.
Yeah. Let's look at page 3. In the second paragraph down, you're dealing with the 1991 fire at Knowsley Heights. And in the first line it says, one of the most significant of the historical fires is the 1991 fire in Knowsley Heights, a residential block of flats which had been refurbished with the addition of thermal insulation to the external walls of the blocks. And then it goes on, it says, the fire started externally to the block and ignited the combustible cladding system, resulting in extensive fire spread across the face of the building, mostly upwards. And then it goes on. Although this was not the first incident of its kind, it raised many concerns and resulted in a change to the test methods used for external cladding systems, namely the introduction of a full-scale fire test, similar to the 8414 test series. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, just help us. It says that this was one of the most significant of the historical fires in the first line. Can you help us? What did you understand to be the significance of the fire at Knowsley Heights?
I mean, it was a fire that from when I first learnt of it, when it was first presented to me as part of my development at BRE, was presented as one of the major fires in terms of understanding external fire spread. It was, I believe, mostly related to the understanding of the need for cavity barriers. I think pre Knowsley Heights, in the first edition of BR 135, there'd been there'd been among its recommendations a belief that with rain screens that achieved Class O with non-combustible substrates, you could forego cavity barriers to a degree, whereas Knowsley Heights made clear that that wasn't the case. You would still get significant external fire spread. And so it resulted in the change, which I think also came into the 1992 edition of ADB, that made clear that rain screen cavities aren't some sort of special cavity that need not have cavity barriers. You need cavity barriers in all forms of cavity, including in rain screens.
Yes. Did you understand the system at Knowsley to be non-combustible?
No, not the entire system. I understood it to be Class O, I think. What I say, at the time this was written, no, I probably did know it was Class O under non-combustible insulation.
Right.
I think that
but what
was
about
what
the
it was.
combustibility of the panels? You say Class 0. Are you talking about the panels that were used at Knowsley? You're saying your understanding was that they were Class 0. What about their combustibility?
As in whether they were non-combustible or limited combustibility.
Well, yeah, anything about their combustibility, because Class 0 doesn't tell us anything about that.
I don't know, I forget, I'm sorry. The only headlines that stick out in my mind about them are Class 0 rain screen and mineral wool incident.
Right. And you talk about, you say it was not the first incident of its kind, this is 4 lines down, it raised many concerns. What were those many concerns? You've talked about cavity barriers. Were there other concerns relating to external wall arrangements that this fire raised?
I don't know. The cavity barrier point was the one I'm aware of. I mean, this, I believe, was written by Martin Shipp. He would have been around at the time, so he would probably be more aware of
Right.
the range of concerns that resulted from it.
Let's go down to page 3. There's a section headed, on that page, there's a section headed Existing Guidance. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the first sentence under that heading reads, Approved Document B recommends restriction on the combustibility of external walls to reduce the danger from fire spread up a building's external face, and also to reduce the susceptibility of the surface to ignition from an external source. It's considered that the use of combustible materials and/or extensive cavities in cladding systems in tall buildings can pose a route for fire spread and hence a danger to life, as shown by the case studies. Now, help us with this. Where does the approved document recommend limiting the combustibility of materials used in the external face of the building, or the external walls of the building?
There's an ongoing, it's not an active debate, but various people have different views as to whether you use the term reaction to fire, spread of flame, combustibility. I would expect, and again, not having written this, the reference to combustibility probably also is intended to mean reaction to fire properties, i.e. Class O and Class B and so on.
Well, I don't really follow that. The specific words used here, it says, Approved Document B recommends restriction on the combustibility of external walls. Now, what clauses of Approved Document B is that referring to?
I would presume clauses 12.6, 12.7, but again, I didn't write this text.
Well, clause 12.6 refers you to diagram 40, yes?
Yes.
You know that. And for walls above 18 metres, it requires either Class 0 or a Euro Class B. Yes?
Yes.
How is that restricting the combustibility of the external wall of the building?
Because Class 0... So this goes back to the point I made earlier. Whether you use the umbrella term reaction to fire or combustibility, it all relates to what. So the term I prefer to use is reaction to fire performance, and I would prefer combustibility to be seen as a subset of reaction to fire performance. It's when you impose a fire onto a material, what does the material do in response? Whether that is flame spreading across its surface, whether it's the release of energy. Ultimately, the material is responding in some way. Class 0, if you achieve Class 0 as compared with, say, Class 3 or 4, Class 0 is less combustible than Class 3 or 4 in that scale of classes.
But it's not testing the combustibility of the product, is it? It's testing the surface spread of flame over the product, yes? That's what Class 0 is doing.
Well, there's also fire propagation, which is about how much energy is given off by the material.
But it's only testing the surface of the product nonetheless, is it?
Well, it's an aspect of the external wall construction.
Let's move on to page 4. There are a number of case studies which are set out in this report, and they're headed up fires since the introduction of BS 8414 test series. Now, I want to see if I can take this shortly. Do you accept that one of the flaws in this work is that these are not really case studies at all, in that they don't contain any information on the basis of which it could possibly be concluded that the existing regulations and guidance in relation to external fire spread were adequate?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Because if I've understood you correctly, you're saying that them not meeting an objective makes them not case studies.
Yes, so that what these case studies don't do is give you any information about the extent to which the regulations and guidance are adequate. And I'll come to some examples of it. I just want to know whether you agree with that proposition or not.
Well, the detail within each case study simply tells you what happened in the case study. So to that extent, I agree. It doesn't. Then within the case study, there is no commentary on the extent to which the guidance is appropriate.
Yes. Let's look at case study 2, for example, at the bottom of that page. That reads, July 2010, a fire started on the balcony of a 12-floor flat of a 16-storey residential block of flats constructed in the 1960s. As can be seen from figure 2, the fire spread from the balcony of origin to the 15th floor and the roof of the building. Several features of the building were attributed to the extent of fire spread, including combustible insulating panels, which were clad onto the underside of all the balconies, cladding panels, which had been installed onto the outer surface of the exterior wall and composed a mineral fibre board face supported on timber battens behind which there was a fibrous combustible insulation material, and plastic drain pipes which were installed at each corner of the building and passed through the concrete floor slab on each floor. There was no evidence of any fire stopping, proprietary seal or sleeve where the pipe passed through the floor slab, and which should have been provided to maintain the level of fire resistance afforded by the concrete floor slab. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, why does this description, for example, not identify the materials and the products to which the extent of fire spread was attributed? We're told these were cladding panels in the middle of that paragraph, and that they'd been installed on the outer surface and comprised a mineral fibre board face supported on timber battens. Why aren't we given more information about the cladding panels and the combustible insulating material?
You mean the identity of the products?
What materials they comprised.
Well, I'm not sure the identity of the materials was fully established within the investigation itself, not for case study 2. There was a level of detail that could be ascertained within the one-day investigation that occurred, but it was, an ordinary fire of special interest report doesn't go anywhere near the level of detail that, say, Lakanal was investigated to.
No. there aren't any comments in this case study in respect of the timescales over which the fire spread, is there?
No, because, I mean, we didn't know, we didn't have a factual record of how long it took for the fire to spread, because what we had, particularly with this, well, both of the fires on this page, was a building that had suffered a fire, and we had some vague accounts as to, you know, whether people felt that things occurred quickly or slowly, the sort of descriptors that you get from witnesses of a tragic event such as this, but we didn't have any quantification of the speed of fire spread.
So what did this example demonstrate to you for the purposes of this report?
As set out here, I mean, it details the extent to which there was a route provided for fire spread. I mean, one of the peculiar issues with this particular fire was the penetration of drain pipes through balconies on the outside of the building that provided a route for fire spread. In the more detailed fire of special interest report, I believe there was some information around the extent to which stairwells became smoke logged before people were able to leave the building, which then goes to, it doesn't quantify the speed of fire spread, but it goes to the extent to which external fire spread presented a risk to life. But in terms of what's recorded here, I believe it's limited to the materials and indeed this feature that permitted fire to bypass the floor slabs at the balconies.
But what do we learn from this case study in respect of the adequacy or otherwise of the building regulations and guidance relating to external fire spread?
One issue is that the guidance around balconies was lacking, and that was looked at as part of another piece of work in relation to this project, carried out under this project. Aside from that, there was the recognition that the materials that were involved in this building, albeit an older building, had permitted fire spread, I think, up 4 stories.
Right.
And onto the roof.
In your second witness statement, I don't think we need to turn it up, at page 54, paragraph 181, you give some more detail about this case study, and you say, for example, that there was a sharp contrast in fire development between the areas of the building which were clad in combustible materials versus those that were not, for example, the concrete. Now, we don't see that stated anywhere in this case study, do we?
No.
So why not, if that's one of the things that case study was telling you? Why isn't that written up in the report?
I don't know. I didn't write the case study.
Were you aware that at the time of this fire, and you've told us in your statement, this is the fire at the Madingley Block, Kingston upon Thames, did you know that at the time of this fire, the building had an architectural crown constructed using a glass reinforced polymer product, a GRP product, as had been used at Knowsley and Garnock? Did you know that?
Certainly not in those terms. I remember seeing the remains of sort of fibrous material when I examined the edge of the roof, but I certainly hadn't had it described to me as a crown before.
The fire had progressed laterally around the top of this architectural feature. Were you aware of that?
No, and I would disagree with that characterisation. I've got a recollection of what the tower looked like from the ground, and there was a V-shaped, fairly traditional V pattern of how the fire had spread up the tower, but it's not as though there was a substantial lateral spread around the crown which hadn't occurred below.
I see. But why is there no discussion at all about that feature of the building in this case study?
Well, as I said, I wasn't aware. I mean, well, maybe it's the terminology. I would not I did not at the time describe it as a crown to the building, and it had it resulted in a band, say, of horizontal fire spread around the top of the building, then it would have been identified as something that had fundamentally altered the fire spread. And we'd have looked further into it, but I don't recall that feature actually promoting substantial horizontal fire spread any more so than the basic V-pattern arrangement that you get from a fire.
I see. If we move on to page 5 and look at the first paragraph of text underneath the photo, that reads as follows. While external fire spread has been an issue, as outlined by these case studies, the authors would also like to acknowledge that there have been successes, as can be seen in case study 3. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, I don't quite follow that. Is it intended to mean that case studies 1 and 2 were incidents which were not successes?
Yes. Case studies 1 and 2 were definitely not what you'd like to have as an outcome.
I see. But where is it pointed out, if we go back a page, that these are failures? Failures of what? Where does it tell us what's gone wrong in these case studies?
Well, I suppose it's the multi-storey fire spread. I understand the point. It's implicit as opposed to being explicit, but there was multi-storey fire spread in both of those case studies.
And why was it on that following page that you were wanting to present something that you say was a success?
It was something that, so the use of successes as opposed to just failures was something that we were encouraged to do. There was, and I think it came from DCLG, and there might also have been some internal BRE side to this, but there was a view that all we ever did was complain about things not being quite right, and they wanted there to be a bit of balance, that we were showing where the system was working occasionally.
And who did that come from within DCLG?
Well, Brian Martin's the only person it would have come from.
Right.
I think, well, it might have first been introduced by Stephen Kelly when he worked with Brian Martin. I think that it was that particular contract, which would have been the 2012. I think the contract meeting we had was where we first started talking about trying to present successes as well as failures.
And was there a particular matter that the BRE had reported on that had led the department to say, we want you to report more on successes?
No, I don't think so. I think in part it was driven by, and funny enough, sprinklers. So that the sprinkler industry has always done a very good job, and it is a good job, of identifying successes, making the point that sprinklers are an effective tool in, mitigating the effects of fire. And it's a credit to them because you don't generally hear about fires that don't go anywhere. It's quite hard to find information about that sort of thing. So the point, I think, was driven by the need to try and make the case back to industry that, look, if you do the right thing, if you make an effort and try and do more, then in spite of, fire starting, it may not lead to these sorts of severe consequences.
I see. Let's look at page 5 again, and case study 3, so one of these successes. So what's said here is, it said a fire occurred in a flat on the 11th floor of a 22-storey block of flats built during the 1960s and refurbished in 2006-07. This refurbishment included the fitting of a new cladding system to the exterior of the building, which comprised an insulated render, the insulation for which was mineral wool and had been tested to and passed BS 8414 Part 1. The fire developed to fully involve the flat of origin and broke out of the windows. The damage to the facade was localised to the immediate vicinity of some of the windows, but beyond this, the damage appeared to have been limited to surface charring and sooting. And then you refer to figure 3, the photograph below. Now, you say in that part of the case study that the insulation was mineral wool and had been tested to and passed BS 8414 Part 1, yes?
Yes.
And if we go to paragraph 187 of your second witness statement on page 57, it says, you say this. You say, my understanding at the time was that the entire system installed on the building had been tested to BS 8414 and classified to BR 135. I attended this investigation as a junior member of staff accompanying Dr. Sarah Colwell. I'd only been working for BRE for 18 months, and at the time I had no prior experience of external wall systems that had been tested to 8414 or classified to BR 135. I recall that Dr. Colwell was contacted by the refurbishment team for the building following the fire, given that the system had been tested to BS 8414 and or classified to BR 135. I asked BRE for further information concerning this fire in order to prepare this witness statement, including a request for Dr. Colwell to provide whatever information she has, but I understand that she's been unable to recall anything further. So is it right at the time you understood that the entire system had been tested to 8414 and possibly classified to BR 135, but you weren't sure, yes?
Yes, correct.
If we go back to page 5, we can see figure 3 that the cladding system is described there as non-combustible. Do you see it says figure 3, block of flats showing limited damage to the non-combustible cladding system after a fire, yes?
Yes.
Now, if the cladding system was non-combustible, there would have been no point in doing a test of BS 8414, yes?
Agreed.
Did that occur to you at the time when you were reading this report?
Sorry, when you say reading this report, do you mean in preparation of my witness statement, or do you mean
I meant
before that?
When you were helping prepare it, when you're one of the...
No, I hadn't appreciated what, you know, that particular point at the time that the article was being prepared, that yes, there, and I agree, there would be no need to test a BS 8414 for a non-combustible system. What I now understand is that the render itself was an acrylic.
Yes, so in fact, you've carried out some work to answer the inquiry's questions, and that's led you to discover that the description at figure 3 is wrong, yes?
Yes.
If we go to your second witness statement, page 56, paragraph 186, you tell us this. You say it was predominantly non-combustible as the insulation within the ETIC's system was mineral wool. However, in light of the additional information I have sought to prepare this witness statement, I can confirm that the render layer in the system was combustible as it was an acrylic render. Yes?
Yes.
So it was not a non-combustible system as described in the report, yes?
Agreed.
And the case study in the report doesn't tell us that the render in the system was combustible, does it?
No, but I don't think, having sought out the Fire of Special Interest report, I don't think that was recorded in there either. So Martin Shipp would have been reliant upon the Fire of Special Interest report, which was written by Sarah Colwell, in preparing the article.
Yes. If we could look at paragraph 182 of your second statement, you say this, case study 3 demonstrated that fire spread could be confined to a floor of origin even if an unusually severe fire were to take hold. The evidence from the Fire and Rescue Service was that the wind-driven fire was difficult to extinguish to the extent that its personnel suffered injuries. In addition, damage to the compartment of fire origin, which was fully consumed by fire, indicated a significant duration. However, in spite of this, and in spite of the use of an acrylic render, the fire did not spread to any stories above, as it did not take hold on the external wall construction. This demonstrated the potential success of BR 135 classification at paragraph 12.5 of the then recently made effective 2006 edition of Approved Document B. Now, the case study presented in the report does not tell us any of that, does it? What you've told us there in your statement about the evidence from the Fire and Rescue Service was that the wind-driven fire was difficult to extinguish. In spite of this and the use of an acrylic render, the fire didn't spread to any other stories. None of that's in the description in the report, is it?
Not to that level of detail, but I think it does make the point that there was a severe fire and it was nonetheless contained.
So the case study in the report doesn't tell us that the fire was unusually severe.
No.
It doesn't tell us that the wind-driven fire was difficult to extinguish.
No.
Doesn't tell us that the fire and rescue officers suffered injuries.
Agreed.
Doesn't tell us that aspects of the fire indicated a significant duration.
No, I don't believe it does.
Doesn't tell us that an acrylic render had been used in the external cladding system.
No.
It doesn't tell us that the authors of the report considered that this demonstrated the potential success of BR135 classification.
I think it does mention the BR135 classification, does it not?
Let's go back to it. So it's BRE 4371, page 55. Don't think it tells us anything about BR135 classification.
No, but it mentions BS 8414, which is the substantive requirement for BR135.
Well, it's a separate process, isn't it, classification to BR135?
Well, 135 is simply the interpretation of results from 8414. It's not as though there are substantial other processes to carry out in order to do the 135 classification. The two go hand in hand.
Let's go to page 6 of the report, CLG 3019445, page 6. In the second paragraph down under common misconceptions, the report states this. It says, a further confusion arises since many elements required for fire safety in buildings are recommended to be fire resisting to demonstrate that they satisfy performance criteria as determined by BSEN 13501 Part 2 or BS 476 fire resistance tests. Fire resistance tests subject a test specimen to a fire exposure that is similar to a fully flashed over compartment fire. Such an exposure is appropriate for interior elements of a building and load-bearing elements. However, it is not evident that such exposure conditions are appropriate for the exterior of a building. Further, as mentioned above, the Class B or naught recommendation and the other recommendations above are intended to limit the rate of fire growth and the fire spread, and there is no evidence to date to suggest that these recommendations are inadequate. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, just with reference to that, did you consider that it was evident that the exposure conditions for testing to BS 476 Part 6 and Part 7 to achieve Class naught were appropriate for the exterior of a building?
I think this goes back to some responses I provided yesterday. My understanding is that the severity of exposure at the window head had been looked at and was deemed to be similar to what you would get within the relevant compartment that was on fire. So the exposure condition is probably about correct, although I don't have personal experience of checking that. The issue is around the manner in which the specimen is exposed.
Right, I see. If we go on with that paragraph on page 6, the last 3 lines say, further, as mentioned above, the Class B or naught recommendation and the other recommendations above are intended to limit the rate of fire growth and fire spread. Now, can you help us? What are the other recommendations above? We can't work out what that's referring to. We can work out that Class B and naught recommendation is probably referring to diagram 40, but the phrase and the other recommendations above, can you help us with what that means?
Not off the top of my head, I'd have to go back through the article.
And then there's the phrase, and there is no evidence to date to suggest that these recommendations are inadequate. So that appears to be referring to the Class B naught diagram 40 recommendation and other unspecified recommendations. No evidence to date to suggest these recommendations are inadequate. Now, did you consider that to be correct at the time this report was written?
Assuming for a moment that other recommendations, it also includes limited combustibility and paragraph 12.7, then I would say that those recommendations probably were or did not appear to be inadequate at that time.
Okay, but help us with this. Why does this report say there's no evidence to date to suggest that these recommendations are inadequate?
On the basis that where they are adhered to, then the outcomes of fires haven't been disproportionate fire losses.
Are we to read this as saying that there was no evidence to suggest that the Class 0 recommendation in diagram 40 was inadequate? Is that how that was meant to read?
Not as an isolated comment. I think the point is that it's seeking to make is in the round, that the combination of provisions altogether are not inadequate.
I see, but it doesn't single out clause 12.7 anywhere, does it?
No. Well, certainly not on this page. I don't know if it does
No.
elsewhere.
Can we agree that a reasonable reading of this might be that what it's saying is that the provisions for Class B and Class 0 in diagram 40, that there's no evidence to date to suggest that these are inadequate? Can we agree that's one reasonable reading of this?
It's one reasonable reading, yes.
Can we agree that that would have been a false assertion for the BRE to be making in this report?
In relation to Class 0, but not in relation to Class B. I think Class B is a good class in terms of the performance that it requires from a product. It tests fundamentally, because the tests are different. Class B looks for different things as compared with, say, Class A2, but I'm aware that certain assemblies of external wall construction that achieve Class A2 have still been proven to have shortcomings when you expose them to the Class B tests. So,
Yes, but it doesn't say, does it, in this paragraph, that the Class B recommendation is okay, but the Class 0 recommendation is not?
Agreed.
So let's stick with the Class 0 recommendation. Can we agree that, for example, the fire at Knowsley Heights showed that a Class 0 recommendation was inadequate?
Not in and of itself, because the big issue with Knowsley Heights was the absence of cavity barriers. And had Knowsley Heights had cavity barriers, and in fairness, also given the broad form of construction, but had it had cavity barriers, then I'm pretty confident that it wouldn't have resulted in what it did.
I see. Were you aware of the work of Dr. Raymond Connolly at the BRE in 1994 and the 10 full-scale tests he carried out and his conclusions about the appropriateness or otherwise of Class 0?
I don't think I was when this was drafted, no.
Were you aware of the recommendations made by the Parliamentary Select Committee examining the external fire spread at Garnet Court? One of those recommendations being that all materials in the external wall arrangement of high-rise buildings should either be non-combustible or should satisfy, effectively, a large-scale fire test.
Again, not when this was written.
You weren't aware of that?
No, I am now.
Were you aware of the full-scale testing that had been carried out by the BRE in 2001 under something called Contract CC 1924 for the department on various cladding systems, including one incorporating an ACM PE product?
No.
Were you told that that ACM PE product had achieved Class 0, but that it had performed disastrously in full-scale fire testing?
No.
You weren't told that?
No, I was not told that.
You weren't aware of that?
No.
And were you aware that others at the BRE, and we see this from, for example, Dr. Debbie Smith's witness statement to the inquiry, considered Class 0 as an inadequate metric because the small-scale testing undertaken to achieve Class 0 could not be relied on as a means to predict or control the fire performance of an external cladding system? Were you aware of that?
Certainly not in those terms, no.
Mr. Chairman, is that an appropriate moment for our break?
Yes, I think it is. We'll have another break now. Dr. Crowder will resume, please, at 25 to 4. And again, please don't discuss your evidence with anyone while you're out of the room. All right? Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 25 to 4. Would you ask Dr. Crowder to come back in, please? All right, Dr. Crowder, ready to keep going?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, Miss Grange, when you're ready.
Yes, so just some follow-up questions from this last session's evidence. We talked about the fact that you'd had a conversation with Brian Martin where you both acknowledged between the two of you that this work was flawed in certain respects. Mr. Martin's witness statement to the inquiry is dated the 23rd of November 2018. Can you help us as to whether or not your conversations with him about that are likely to have been before that point or after?
Sorry, given that data, it may well be after. Probably not very long after, but it may well be after.
And when you say probably not very long after, what makes you say that?
Because I think it's a conversation I would have had when I was still at BRE, which I left BRE in May 2019. So,
Ms. Grange, I'm going to interrupt you because in my case, at least, the transcript isn't running. Is yours?
Same. I've noticed it's not flowing.
Do you think this is going to take more than a couple of minutes? Right. I think. Sorry, Dr. Crowder. These things happen from time to time. I think the best thing is we'll rise for as long as it takes to get this sorted out. So do go back with the usher, please. Right. Ms. Grange, thank you very much. We'll retire and we'll wait to be told when things are ready.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you ask Dr. Crowder to come back in, please? Well, Dr. Crowder, I think we've solved the problem, so we'll keep going and hope for the best.
Right.
Right, thank you. Yes, Ms. Green.
Yes, thank you. Let me re-put the question that I put before we discovered the transcript wasn't working. So I'm interested to know when it is that you had this conversation with Mr. Martin about the work on these external fire spread reports being flawed. His witness statement to the inquiry is dated the 23rd of November 2018. Was it before or after that time that you had those conversations with him?
Yeah, so during our unscheduled break, I was having a think about this. I suspect it was one of the conversations I had with him after I'd decided to leave BRE, and just sort of reflective chats about my time at BRE and the reasons for me going and pressures and so on, and that came up as part of that.
Okay,
So
that would be after November 2018?
Yes, that would.
Yes. Now, help us with this. We saw that it is stated in the first part of the report, the article we looked at, that there was no evidence that the Class 0 recommendation was inadequate. Yes, that text is there. Yesterday, you told us that in around 2007, 2008, you had decided in your own mind that it wasn't really a fit-for-purpose metric for external walls. You explained to us that you'd had a conversation in or around 2008 with Brian Martin that it wasn't appropriate. And you've also told us that in 2015 you gave evidence to the Singapore Supreme Court on the appropriateness or otherwise of Class 0, and you said you weren't a fan of Class 0. Now, in the light of all of that and what you told us yesterday, can you explain how we get that statement in the report that suggests that there's no evidence that the Class 0 recommendation is inadequate?
I cannot. I mean, all I can say is, again, I did not write that particular part of the article. Admittedly, I read it, but I hadn't picked up on the dual citing of both Class B and Class 0.
I see. So you would have only been happy with it saying that the Class B recommendation is...
That would certainly have been my preference, yes.
Your preference. But you don't recall raising that at the time?
No.
If we look at page 6 of the report, if we could go back to the report, CLG 3019445, and look at page 6, the conclusions, it's stated in the second line of that first paragraph, with the exception of one or two unfortunate but rare cases, there is currently no evidence from these investigations to suggest that the current recommendations to limit vertical fire spread up the exterior of high-rise buildings are failing in their purpose. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, help us with this. What are the one or two unfortunate but rare cases referred to there?
I'm not sure. Was this not asked of me in my witness statement?
Well, it may have been, but
Struggling
not sure
to
we've
think.
got a clear answer. It clearly states there, with the exception of one or two unfortunate but rare cases, there's currently no evidence from these investigations to suggest that the current recommendations are failing in their purpose. Can you help us here today as to what those unfortunate but rare cases were?
I mean, I would imagine one of them might have been Lakanal House itself.
Right.
Again, beyond that, I don't know. It would have been in the mind of probably Martin Shipp as the person that was primarily writing this at the time.
Well, why aren't they named? I mean, if you're saying there's unfortunate but rare cases in the conclusion section, why isn't it clear to the reader what those are?
Well, Lakanal isn't named because we were asked not to mention Lakanal. We were asked not to discuss it in relation to this further work that was being carried out for risk of it prejudicing the criminal prosecution. I did specifically raise it with London Fire Brigade that I wanted to mention Lakanal in relation to this work, and that permission was not granted.
Right, so you specifically said you wanted to say that Lakanal was an example of...
Well, sorry, let me correct that. At this, because this is the first report, isn't it? This is part one. So at this stage, the request was for me to keep my distance from it with an implication that Lakanal was not to be drawn into it. The specific instruction not to mention Lakanal came later after the part two research, but ultimately that was there.
Right. So you could have named Lakanal here if that was one of the unfortunate but rare cases which suggested that the current recommendations were failing?
I don't think there was a specific don't mention Lakanal, although I say that I'm not 100% sure, but there was an email exchange with London Fire Brigade, and they did not want me in particular associated, and they didn't want Lakanal associated with this work.
Right. And we see in the paragraph below, in the so the penultimate paragraph, the final sentence reads, "A number of significant fires, such as those discussed previously, have demonstrated the potential risks." The potential risks are not identified anywhere in this report. Can you help us as to why that is?
No, I mean, again, I can refer back to the general point about the case studies 1 and 2 clearly involve multi-storey fire spread involving, I think, 6 and 4 stories respectively. But no, the specific risks are not identified, and I can't help with why that is.
Right. Let's go to part 2 of the research now. This is at BRE 3043751. Now, this paper, is this right, presents results from 3 full-scale experiments which were carried out on modified BS 8414 test rigs. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said earlier that it was more this aspect of the project that you felt was flawed. Is that correct?
Yes.
Do you accept that this research was so fundamentally flawed as to make the conclusions drawn from it completely meaningless?
I wouldn't say they were completely meaningless, but I would say they were very difficult for the uninformed reader to follow. I mean, from a practical perspective, or not practical, but Brian Martin as the client, and having been involved in the inquest and the discussions with Ronnie King, he would have understood what it meant and what it was trying to look at and what it was, the question it was seeking to answer in terms of fire resistance. But I fully accept that, to an uninformed reader, it would have been very difficult to follow.
Right. We can see on the first page the report's dated the 9th of January 2014. I think we've established this should read 2015, yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, if we go to page 6, under the subheading 1.2, project objectives there, it's below the middle of the page, it tells us the aim of this project was to carry out a limited series of experiments to assess the performance of different external facades, including non-fire rated double glazing, when exposed to a fire from below, representative of the external face of a building, and to provide a report of findings from the experiments to inform DCLG building regulations and standards division. Yes?
Yes.
And if we go back up to the executive summary on page 3, we can see in the 5th paragraph down, there's a paragraph beginning 3 full-scale fire experiments. Do you have that?
Yes.
It says 3 full-scale fire experiments were carried out on a fire-resisting, demonstrates resistance to fire for a specific period of time, Class 3, National Fire Classification, and Class B S2D0, European Fire Classification spandrel panel with double glazing above. The test method used was similar to BS 8414, but the test rig was modified to address the aims of this particular study. The fire scenario represented a fully flashed over fire breaking out of a compartment and spreading up the external facade, yes?
Yes.
So the purpose of this research, in summary, was to ascertain the respective fire performances of a Euro Class B panel, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
A fire-resisting panel, yes?
Yes.
And a Class 3 panel, is that correct?
Yes, although I think, and I suspect it's deliberate, the reference to Class 3 was via the the notional fire performances table. So effectively we used a timber panel because timber is deemed to be Class 3 in untreated form.
Well, we'll come back to that in a moment. Answer this for me. Why Euro Class B rather than National Class 0? Why didn't you have a National Class 0 panel as one of the 3 experiments?
Probably simply because the panel we sourced was a Class B panel.
Well, given the concerns that had been raised by Mr. King, and we saw those in his emails, about the difference that a Class 0 panel, not a Class B panel, a Class 0 panel would make, Why not select a national Class 0 panel? Wasn't that of particular importance for this experiment?
Well, the Class B panel is also, well, it would achieve Class 0 if it were tested accordingly. But I presume what you're implying is a panel that achieves Class 0 but somehow fails to achieve Class B.
Yes, and we do know there are many of those now,
Yes,
don't
but
we?
that wasn't a concern that was actually raised by Ronnie King. His concern was the absence of fire resistance, not whether or not Class O was actually adequate.
Well, we've gone through his emails, and I'd suggest to you that actually his concern was that a Class 0 panel wouldn't have made any difference at Lakanal, given the limitations of Class 0 being effectively, as he put it, a surface spread of flame classification. I appreciate he was wanting it replaced with a fire-resisting panel, but he was clearly concerned about national Class 0. Do you not accept that?
I don't agree, no. That's not my interpretation of the way he put his views across. He was concerned that reaction to fire, combustibility, however you want to term it, that metric of performance was not sufficient in isolation.
Right. What particular aspect of fire performance was being assessed in these tests? Help us with that.
Well, again, it was whether or not the addition of fire resistance would make a difference. So in terms of the way the instrumentation was set up, it was to try and reach a view as to whether these three levels of performance would lead to different outcomes in terms of the likelihood or speed with which this fully developed fire emitting from underneath would likely spread to the story above.
Right. Now, we're not going to go through the whole report line by line, but just summarising, is it right that you modified the 8414 test rig in the burn hall at BRE's Watford campus, yes?
Yes.
That was in line with the suggestion you'd made to Debbie Smith in your email back in July, yes, that we looked at earlier. Was it you who designed the rig?
In broad terms, but I didn't do the detailed design, no.
A timber crib fire source was used in dimensions similar to those used in BS 8414 tests, yes?
Yes.
Sorry, help us with this. Who did do the detailed design of the rig then? It wasn't you.
It's probably as between Nathan Cole and Ciara Holland.
Right. And a non-fire resisting double glazing unit was used within the test rig, yes?
Yes.
Let's go to page 6 and to section 2, methodology. You say there, BRE Global has carried out a series of large-scale experiments in the BRE Burn Hall using 3 different types of external facade systems of types used in residential properties that incorporate both non-fire rated double glazing units and spandrel panels of varying combustibility. Now, what was actually known about the combustibility or otherwise of these 3 panels?
In terms of whether they were limited combustibility or not, I believe the fire-resisting panel was either non-combustible or limited combustibility. But again, this goes back to the point as to whether you deem combustibility to be strictly limited to non-combustible, limited combustibility or not, or whether you deem it to include reaction to fire classes more broadly.
Right. Now, if we go to page 10, under the section headed Materials, we're told in the first line at 2.2 that the following items were sourced by BRE Global and installed into the experimental frame. Who selected these 3 types of panels to be tested?
It was a somewhat opportunistic selection, I believe. So in effect, the broad classes in terms of, let's aim for a Class 3 or thereabouts, a Class O, Class B or thereabouts, and something fire resisting.
Hang on, stop there. Sorry, you just said a Class 0 or Class B or thereabouts.
Sorry, not or thereabouts, Class 0 or Class B. So let me narrow that. Apologies.
Yes, but did you consider those 2 to be equivalent at the time you were selecting these panels? Is that why we only see a Class B panel and not a Class 0 panel?
No, the reason we have a Class B panel, and would you mind if we go back to the page that references Class B? I believe what has been, because it's not, the Class B that is listed in this report is not Class B S3D2. It is not the class that is actually specified in ADB. The class that is there is Class B S2D naught.
Yeah, you're right.
So it's a specific reference to the class of performance that was on the panel that was obtained.
I see.
So and then this goes back to my answer to the question that you have just asked, which was around the selection of these panels. I mean, in the time that was available, there was, frankly, a bit of a rush, I think, on the part of the team to simply go to suppliers and see what panels could be sourced in the time available to use in the experiments.
So where were they sourced from? Just what, local suppliers in Watford?
I don't know whether it would have been in Watford, but yes, local suppliers.
And who arranged for the purchase and delivery of those materials?
Would have been Nathan Cole or Keir Harland.
And if we look at the bullet points at section 2.2 on page 10, the first bullet point describes the spandrel panel you've described in the executive summary as Class B S2D0. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we look at the note, so the bullet point says it's a compressed stone fibre spandrel panel with an organic binding agent. This panel, as part of a specific system for external facades, demonstrates a reaction to fire performance of Class B S2D0. Now, so what we learn there is that this panel, tested as part of a specific system, has achieved the Class B S2D0 rating, yes?
Yes.
And we see in the note below, it says, note, for the purposes of this experiment, only the spandrel panel, a single component part of the system, and not the complete system was used. Therefore, the reaction to fire performance for this panel has been assumed as Class B S2D0, but this was not confirmed as part of this programme of work, yes?
Yes.
In other words, you did not establish that the panel you describe as Class B was actually capable of achieving that European fire classification, yes?
Correct, although, I mean, based on my own experience, I would be quite comfortable that a panel of that composition would probably achieve Class B.
But that would be an assumption, yes?
It's not just an assumption, it's based on expert opinion.
No. Why not use a panel which you could actually confirm had been classified itself to Class B, not as part of a system?
I presume because the team were not able to find a panel which had a standalone classification.
Moving on to the second bullet
Sorry,
point.
had you finished what you wanted to say?
Not quite, no. Thank
Sorry,
you.
carry on.
It is, so for the proper testing of panels such as this to the European classes requires that they are tested in a representative end-use condition. That is part of the European test standard.
Yeah, it requires that they have a substrate
Yes.
that the panels are tested upon.
A substrate, or it may require a cavity to be fitted behind the panel with then something else beyond the cavity. The point is that has to be representative. I mean, I can't say, sitting here now, whether it was a cavity arrangement or whether it was fixed directly to a substrate. But the point I'm coming to is it would be potentially unusual for a panel to be tested somehow in a standalone arrangement, because the manufacturer would then struggle to sell their product legitimately for an end-use condition because it hadn't been tested for an end-use condition.
Okay. Moving on to the second bullet point there, is it right that this text gives detail of the fire-resisting panel described in the executive summary?
Yes.
This was a cement fibre board, yes?
Yes.
And we learn from the third line of that second bullet point that it says this board can achieve a 60-minute fire resistance rating when installed in accordance with the details in the relevant BS 476 test report. And then it goes on, for the purposes of reporting, this panel will be referred to as fire resisting from herein. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then the note underneath says, note, this board was intended for internal use as BRE Global was not able to source an off-the-shelf fire-resisting external board. The panel is capable of achieving 60 minutes fire resistance when installed within a complete system and tested to BS 476 Part 21. However, for the purposes of this programme of work, the panel was not installed as per the test report. Now, help us as to this. Why was the BRE not able to source an off-the-shelf fire-resisting external board?
Again, lack of time.
Now, the panel may have achieved 60 minutes fire resistance when tested to 476 Part 21 as part of a complete system, but do you accept that that tells us nothing about the fire resistance or otherwise of the board when used outside of that tested system?
It tells you a limited amount of information. It depends on the system that it was allied to. So if, for instance, it was tested on a substrate which itself contributed to the fire resistance, then I agree it wouldn't tell us anything. I would hope, and again, I wasn't involved in selecting the boards, but I would expect the team to have identified whether there was if it was backed up with, say, very chunky mineral wool, I would expect that to have been identified, that it wasn't actually telling you the whole, or a close to whole story about the panel.
Right, but we don't know that from this report, do we?
Not from this report, no.
Do you accept that calling it a fire-resisting panel is potentially inaccurate and misleading, given the note and the qualification that's made there?
No, I don't think it's misleading, because it still is a panel which provides a fire-resisting function. I'll take the point that we don't have an absolute quantification of the period of fire resistance, but it is there to provide a function of fire resistance when it is used in construction.
Can we agree that a 9mm cement fibre board for internal use would never be used as an external cladding on a building?
Agreed.
Do you agree it's certainly not representative of the external face of a building, which is what this report describes in both the executive summary and in the publishable summary?
To a point, but fire resistance, the fire performance is what it is. I mean, we didn't need, for instance, the boards to be able to keep the rain out or to withstand wind loadings. We simply needed to see how a fire resistance performance would withstand the fire scenario.
I see. So you don't accept that describing this board as representative of the external face of a building was potentially misleading?
Well, not given the specific caveat that we've made, that it is a board that is for internal use. That was acknowledged. So we're not misleading in that way.
The third bullet on this page gives details of the Class 3 panel that was selected. Is that right?
Yes.
And if we look at the note, it says, note, there was no evidence available of the fire rating of this panel, hence Class 3 is only assumed based upon guidance provided in approved document B. For the purposes of reporting, this panel will be referred to herein as Class 3. And we can see it was a sheet of structural hardwood plywood of certain dimensions. Do you see that?
Yes.
So this paragraph in this scientific research report is telling us that there's no evidence that this board was actually Class 3, but we're going to call it Class 3. Is that fair?
Well, again, it was based on there's a performance table in approved document B, which is based on historic data about the general performance of timber. Timber is a pretty reliable material in terms of fire performance.
But why not use a Class 3 panel, one that you know had actually achieved Class 3 and only Class 3 in a BS 476 Part 7 test?
Probably because there wouldn't have been any Class 3 timber panels available, because no one tests timber to prove that it's Class 3. It's taken as being its performance. And again, within the time that was available, I think there was only a week between this being accepted and the experiments taking place, the team would not have been able to find a timber panel that had been specifically tested to Class 3.
But why didn't the BRE test it? So you knew before you carried out these tests that you were right to make that assumption?
Because there wasn't the resource available in the project.
Now, it's right, isn't it, that the 3 tests resulted in drastically different fire durations, burning rates, and imposed heat fluxes being generated by the notionally identical timber cribs that were used, yes?
Yes, although there are reasons for those. One involved glass falling onto the crib, and the other involved a crib that it appeared had not been properly conditioned.
Yes, so it was thought, is this right, that due to the moisture content of the timber cribs having varied across the 3 experiments, that explained why you got drastically different fire durations, burning rates and imposed heat fluxes imposed by the crib, yes?
Not quite. The moisture content only varied in the final test, or we believe it only varied in the final test.
I see. But that's another problem with these tests, isn't it? That you weren't imposing the same fire load on the 3 samples.
The intention certainly was to impose the same fire load. So the first test, there was a large pane of glass that fell onto the crib, which obviously wouldn't occur during an 8414 test because they don't normally include glass. But that sheet of glass restricted the ventilation to the crib. And so it altered the way in which it burnt and the way that it imposed heat onto the structure. But aside from that, I'm confident that tests 1 and 2, the crib was notionally the same. The issue, as I say, was test 3, where it became apparent, I think, during the test. I was watching it and it didn't look right, and it became apparent that something had gone awry with that crib.
So why not rerun that test or try and make sure the glazing didn't hit the crib in another test? I mean, why report that up if you've had that problem? Why don't you say, well, that undermines what we're doing. We need to do more to get this consistent across the 3?
The problems were reported in the report. There was no inclination to enable the test to be rerun. And as I said, this project was run on extremely limited resources.
Let's go to page 15 and section 3.1.1. At the bottom of the page under temperature data, in the final paragraph, it says this: due to the severity of the fire, the fixings for the thermocouples on the front of the glazing and the spandrel panel did not hold. Now, I think this is for the fire-resisting panel. This allowed for the thermocouples to move around in the plume, and this explains the sporadic temperature variances as seen in figure 12. To help rectify this in the remaining experiments, the thermocouples were more firmly secured with staples into the spandrel panel. So the thermocouples came loose from their fixings during the test, yes?
Yes.
And that would essentially invalidate the test, yes?
It would invalidate those temperature measurements.
Why not say that in the report?
Well, it says the temperature, there are sporadic temperature variances, which, I mean, it may not say it in the words you've said, but it is effectively saying there are big temperature variances, so don't rely on these temperature measurements or this data plot.
Why wasn't this test repeated to ensure that valid thermocouple data was actually obtained?
No resources to do so.
Let's look at the conclusions of this testing on page 35. It says in the first paragraph, 3 full-scale fire experiments were carried out on a fire-resisting, a Class 3 and a Class 0 spandrel panel, all with double glazing above. The experiments were based on the methodology used in BS 8414, but the test rig was modified to assess the aims of this particular study. The fire scenario represented a fully flashed over fire breaking out of a compartment and spreading up the external facade. Now, you say there 3 full-scale experiments were carried out on a fire-resisting Class 3 and a Class 0 spandrel panel. That's not right, is it?
No.
So why did that not get picked up?
I don't know.
That's a pretty significant error, isn't it, to describe the panel as Class 0 when it wasn't Class 0, it was a Class B panel, or, well, possibly a Class B panel.
I would be more concerned in the other way around. If we'd only used a Class 0 panel that could not achieve Class B and then declared it as being Class B, that would worry me. A Class B panel, I'm very confident, will achieve Class 0, and I note that 2 paragraphs down, it does revert to Class B. But I take your point, it's a typo that shouldn't have been in there.
Well, there's another typo in the second paragraph of that conclusion. The fire-resisting and Class 0 panels remained intact for the duration of the fire. It's a typo that's repeated twice, yes?
Yes.
And it might lead readers to think that you had actually tested a Class 0 panel, yes?
It might if these were the only 2 paragraphs being read, but there are, as I said, there's a reference below to Class B, and it's Class B is used earlier in the report.
Moving on to the third paragraph, the report says in those conclusions, in terms of the performance of the fire-resisting and Class B panels, they behaved in a similar manner. As mentioned above, the glazing failed in both experiments, but both panels remained intact. But the glazing failed in all 3 experiments, isn't that right?
Yes, I think this was in specific reference to whether there was a differentiator to be. Sorry. In terms of the original question posed as to whether there is a different outcome to be gained from whether you have simply the reaction to fire performance or the fire resistance performance, the point is there was no difference there, because whether you have the Class B or the fire resisting panel, the point of failure remains the window.
Can you explain why, in that sentence that's comparing the performance of the fire-resisting and Class B panel and saying they behaved in a similar manner, why aren't the drastically different fire durations, burning rates and imposed heat fluxes generated by the notionally identical timber cribs mentioned in these conclusions?
Because the analysis and indeed the length of time for which experiment 3 was allowed to go on for, that we sought as far as we could to take into account what went differently, particularly with experiment 3, so that we could still provide a finding that was useful. It wasn't ignored, but the conclusion was it wasn't the conclusion. How do I put this? It wasn't a conclusion save for the fact that the experiments or the last experiment had occurred differently. It was a conclusion that took account of the fact that the third experiment had behaved differently.
Do you agree with this, that no conclusions from the tests presented in this research can be drawn other than the self-evident fact that a Class 3 spandrel panel is likely to result in windows above the fire becoming more rapidly compromised, which you would have already known and would not have needed to carry out any tests to establish?
No, I disagree with that, because what the Class 3 panel did was burn through. It goes back to the point during the Lakanal inquest that the Class 3 panel physically burnt through and physically introduced flames into the compartment above, back inside the building, where someone might be above a compartment that's on fire. Whereas the Class B and the fire-resisting panels both held up to that attack. They did not introduce flames into the room above, and the point of failure was ultimately the glazing and not the panel itself.
So what finding from this research was useful in terms of regulating external fire spread?
That there wasn't a need to introduce fire resistance as a requirement for external wall fire spread, and in light of the government position at the time, there wasn't a need to go looking for 2 other safety provisions to delete to make room for that.
How did this research show that there was no need to do that? I'm not quite following.
Because the outcome for the Class B and the fire resisting panel was the same. There was the same point of weakness, which is the glazing. Whereas with the Class 3 panel, the weak point actually occurred within the panel itself. Right,
I see. Now let's turn to the published version of this article from April 2016, which is at CLG 3019444. And let's look at page 9 here, where the conclusions are set out. Those are identical to the conclusions in the research report we've just looked at, save for the final paragraph above the heading references, which says this: overall, the findings from this research show that there is a clear and demonstrable need to ensure that buildings are designed and constructed so that the fire spread across the external surface and within the external facade is inhibited as required by the building regulations. There is adequate guidance available in the public domain to allow this to be achieved. Now, how, on the basis of these experiments and the information provided in the Part 1 article that we've looked through, could the BRE possibly have drawn that conclusion?
Well, again, we were unable to specify that. And so, running back to the objectives even of this document, we were unable to specify that the objective was to address an issue that had arisen during the Lakanal inquest. We were therefore trying to set out findings without a point of reference that we would have liked to have had. There wasn't a need to introduce fire resistance to external walls demonstrated by this piece of work, and to that extent the guidance didn't need revision. The reaction to fire aspect of the guidance on external fire spread was deemed to be adequate.
But it's a very broad statement there, isn't it? It doesn't say specifically in relation to fire resistance there's adequate guidance available. It's a very broad-reaching statement, isn't it?
Yes, I accept that.
And too broad, given the nature of the experiments and the extent to which, as we've explored, there were a number of problems with the tests you carried out.
Agreed.
Why did that conclusion appear in the published article but not in the earlier research report?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't around much when these were turned into articles. I don't know why this appeared here.
At page 2 of this article, if we scroll up to that, under objectives, the report notes, in the second paragraph, it says, it should be noted that this work did not test the performance of specific product systems and was not a comprehensive research study, but rather a scoping study, and as such, the results need to be considered within this context, yes?
Yes.
Now, in your second witness statement, you say at paragraph 105, page 33, you say this piece of work was not research in the true sense. It was a scoping study carried out using what little funding was available so as to try and gauge whether a full programme of research was actually warranted, bearing in mind the level of justification that would likely be needed given the constraints being placed upon any form of development of fire safety at the time. Yes. Now, is it your evidence that throughout your work on this project, you were under the impression that the scoping study you'd produced might lead to a full programme of research?
I certainly would have liked it to. I'm not sure how optimistic I was that it would actually occur, but I would have liked it to.
I appreciate you might have liked it to, but I'm not interested in what your hope was, or I'm interested in whether you actually understood at the time that it was a scoping study that might well lead to further research.
In the fullness of time, yes, but I think realistically there was for that to occur, there would need to be a change in attitude in terms of funding of research. But having this done, as in having this piece of work done and having it on file, if you like, was seen as advantageous because at least it's there, it's setting out the scope, and when funding becomes available, it would be there as something to return to.
Right. Can we just look at a document, BRE 30433796? We can see this is a document which is a copy of the final research report for Brian Martin. This one is dated the 31st of March 2015. And if we scroll down to page 4 of this document, we can see that Brian Martin has commented on this draft. You can see the comments in the right-hand side. You see the little comment bubble next to the text that's highlighted, yes?
Yes.
And we can see on the right-hand side there's a comment written by Brian Martin. And we can see he said, not keen on this. It's under the heading Common Misconceptions. I'd suggest deleting it or moving it and distancing yourselves from it by adding, it has been suggested that some, but deleting it would be better as it doesn't add to the content of the article. And what's said, the bit he wants deleted is, guidance is presented in section 12 of ADB, which states that external walls are elements of structure and the period of fire resistance depends on the use, height and size of the building concerned, yes?
Yes.
And if we go down to page 7, we can see 2 comments here. Sorry, there was that comment, not keen on this, under the heading Common Misconceptions. Sorry, I think the part that I meant to read was under the heading Common Misconceptions, that's highlighted there. Do you see that? To mobilise the resources necessary for their building stock and or in carrying out a fire safety risk assessment are unable to determine whether or not the cladding on the building conforms to guidance. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And that wording was deleted from the final draft of the report, wasn't it?
Yes.
And the second comment relates to the heading Conclusions.
Sorry, just to be clear, this is the article. This is an article, not a report.
I beg your pardon, this
Yes.
is the article. And then under the heading Conclusions, there's another yellow passage that's highlighted where the text had read, it was agreed with DCLG to carry out a new experimental investigation of external fire spread. Yes?
Yes.
And he says in his comments, I think he should say that the further work is a scoping study. This suggests something more substantial. Yes?
Yes.
So calling this work a scoping study was in fact Brian Martin's suggestion, yes?
I see he's making the point here, and this is what, in 2015, but I always thought of it I never thought of it as a full programme of research. I would not deem the piece of work, and wouldn't have at the time deemed it to be a full programme of research. And again, Brian Martin and the team were all well aware of the fact that we were making the best that we could of the resources that we had.
Right.
A full programme of research on this sort of topic would have taken at least 1, if not 2 or 3 years, and funding of the order of £150,000, £200,000 rather than the 17 that we had to work with.
Right. But the original author, had described the further work as a new experimental investigation, and Brian Martin wanted that describing as a scoping study, yes?
Yes, but that's his suggestion is a more accurate description, and it's my understanding of the work, and was always my understanding of the work.
Yeah. Now, in your second witness statement, you're at pains to emphasise the extremely limited amount of time available to conduct the experiments and the budgetary constraints that you were under. For example, you tell us in your second statement, at paragraph 232 on page 66, that BS 8414 tests at the time were normally charged at around £12,000 per test. But you did these 3 ad hoc experiments within a week for around £17,000. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you say in your statement at paragraph 278 on page 74 that you did the best you could under difficult circumstances.
Yes.
Why did you accept these difficult circumstances? Why not say, no, this is impossible, this is not proper scientific research, this is not being funded properly, not being given the time properly? Why didn't you say that to the department?
Because, I know this is actually linked to a question you asked me yesterday, which I've since had time to reflect on. It wasn't in my gift to tell DCLG no. This was under the broader framework, and the expectation was that the work would be done.
Right. Mr. Chairman, I'm conscious of the time,
Yes.
but I lost some time due to the transcript. I think I'm going to be about another 10 minutes before I finish my questions. Am I okay to carry on?
Just give me a moment. It's going to embarrass you. You're right. Thank you. You okay? Yes, very well. You carry on. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, you tell us in your second witness statement, if we go to page 38, paragraph 120, 4 lines up from the end of that paragraph, you say, my understanding from discussions with Brian Martin was it was highly unlikely any funding would be secured for a standalone research project on any subject. So the work would have to be carried out within the budgets available from the Investigation of Real Fire's experimental budget, yes?
Yes.
So you had discussions with Brian Martin that it was highly unlikely any funding would be secured, is that right?
Certainly at the time the project was undertaken, yes.
Right. And did you consider at the time that it would be better to carry this work out in difficult circumstances under severe time constraints and on a shoestring budget than not carry it out at all? Was that your view?
I think so. And again, I know this was a point you put to me yesterday, but I would sooner try and make the best of a difficult situation than simply walk away and do nothing. I don't agree with the principle of just, let's just not bother, let's just declare it's too hard. I did want to try and do something. And again, I acknowledge the work was flawed, but I've been through many years during my career of trying to make the best of less than ideal situations. And I think you do the best that you can with what you have.
Yes. If we look at paragraph 122 of your statement on page 39, you're speaking there about the negative political drivers behind this project. And you say this, you say, given the above, the need which arose from Lakanal House was to establish whether or not existing provisions were adequate. This was particularly important because if they were not, and there was a recommended change to guidance, DCLG, effectively Brian Martin, would be tasked with finding up to 3 other life safety provisions, more if there was more than one recommendation, to delete to make room for it. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, where did you get that understanding from, that the government would have to find at least 3 other life safety provisions to delete if one was going to be added, a positive one was going to be added?
So discussions with Brian Martin. I also knew more generally about the government's red tape challenge at the time. But yes, I mean, it was understood between us that, if there is a need to do something, if there really is a need for change, then we'll get the change made. He'd do his best to try and make a case for it. But equally, everything in approved document B is there for securing life safety. If, the government policy of what was 1 in, 1 out, then 1 in, 2 out, and so on, that meant very difficult decisions would have to be made. If you were going to introduce something new, something else was going to have to go. And that's not something anyone wants to have to do, but it means that you don't know whether this was deliberate or not on the part of those that set up that policy, but it does focus the mind in terms of how decisions might be made on what changes to be made.
Well, I have to say I find that puzzling. Isn't it the task of the advisor to tell, in this case, the government, what needs to be done, and maybe to give the government an order of priority as you see it, and let them decide what to do?
Yes, I mean, and don't get me wrong, the work was done and the findings were provided. It's just that I understood the parameters that were sitting around that.
Well, I'm suggesting it wasn't for you to worry about the parameters.
Maybe not. Okay, I understand.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you.
Did you consider at any time it to be a matter of professional integrity to alert Mr. Martin or the DCLG to the fact that this work could not be done properly without proper time and proper funding?
Well, again, on the proviso that it was a scoping study, and that when the opportunity arose, when there was funding available, more could be done. It was, as I said, it was a step in the right direction. It wasn't anything more than a step. It wasn't a conclusion, but it gave us an indication of the issue. So to that extent, no, I don't agree with your proposition.
Right. I want to turn to a final very short topic now, which is about some emails you received from Mr. Martin after the Grenfell Tower fire. Can we turn to CLG 3036408? There's an email at the bottom of that page from Mr. Martin on the 16th of June 2017, where he says, Debbie, Dave, Sarah, so this is going to Debbie Smith, to you and Sarah Colwell, I've been asked to prepare a rebuttal of the assertion that PE cord ACM panels comply with the guidance in ADB. I've also been asked if an independent expert would be willing to say this or something similar in public. And then over the page, he says, can you consider the attached and let me know, please? And there's an attachment entitled Rebuttal of Times article. And if we have a look at the prepared rebuttal, this is at NHB 401458. Here we can see the draft text that Mr. Martin is sending of a rebuttal to be sent to the Times about whether the cladding at Grenfell Tower was or was not precluded by the guidance in approved document B. Now, was this your first direct contact with Mr. Martin post-fire? Do you know? So it's the 16th of June.
Yeah, no, well, I would have been in contact with him on the 14th of June because our initial attendance to Grenfell was under the investigation of real fires contract before we were requisitioned by the police. So, yeah, so my first contact with him would have been on the 14th of June. And then I probably would have contacted him again to let him know we had been requisitioned by the police. And then this would have been the first contact after that.
Right. Were you surprised to have received this approach from Mr. Martin?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, on the 16th of June, I was probably not really thinking in terms of surprise, or I was probably quite emotionally numb at that point. Yeah.
Did you read his proposed rebuttal statement?
I'm not sure that I did. I don't know. And sorry, just returning to the email.
Yeah, let's go back to the emails.
Because on the 16th of June.
So it's CLG 3036408.
And again, I do apologise, my memory of these days is a bit fuzzy at this point. But I did have to speak to Debbie on the 16th of June, which was the Friday, because that was when, and obviously, for reasons that are now a lot clearer than they were then, the Met wanted to do a due diligence check on BRE over the weekend, which is why I'd been speaking to Debbie. And I would guess that I attempted to look up the article and couldn't, hence the point it's no longer live.
We can see from the email above, from Debbie Smith to Brian Martin, copying you in, she says, hi Brian, just spoken to David, it's my understanding that this is now no longer live. If this is wrong and you need to discuss, please let me know. And then above he says, hi Debbie, I still need an expert, but it can't be an employee of BRE. That's the approach I agreed with the Met Police. See you in the morning. Do you see that?
Yes.
Had you spoken to Brian Martin about this?
I don't think I had, no, but this again was around the time when it was becoming clear there would be a strict separation between my team's work as part of the Met investigation and then whatever else was going on in the wider sphere. I know that colleagues, including Debbie Smith and Julie Bragula, were deployed within other bits of government in response to Grenfell.
Right.
I was kept very much siloed from that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that time. I've finished all of my prepared questions. If we could perhaps have a short break, perhaps 10 minutes.
Yes. Well, Dr. Crowder, you may know this, but when Council gets to the end of her prepared questions, we have to have a short break so that she can take stock and others can perhaps suggest further questions that we need to put to you. So we'll break now. We'll come back at 5 to 5. Will that give enough time?
That would be great. Thank you.
We'll come back at 5 to 5 and then we'll see whether there are any more questions for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, thank you very much. 5 to 5, please. Would you ask Dr. Crowder to come back in, please? Right, Dr. Crowder, let's see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Two questions, or two quick questions. You mentioned in your evidence yesterday that at one point, in relation to the investigation of Real Fires project, you had a call saying that the department wanted you to shave 20% off your fees.
Yes.
Can you give us any kind of time frame for when that was?
I think it was after I became project manager, so it would have been 2015 or later. The call was directed at me because I was the project manager.
Thank you. And can I take you to something in Dr. Lane's Phase 1 report? If you go to BLAS 5027 at page 62. So this is about your understanding of what the external wall surface is. Yeah, so we had long debates yesterday about the definition of class naught in paragraph 13 of Appendix A of ADB. And I just want to understand from you, 3 different options are given here, option 1, 2 and 3, about what is meant by the external surface of the walls or the external surface in diagram 40 and 12.6 of ADB. Can you help us with what your understanding of it is currently, or as the guidance applied previously? Is it option 1, that the external surface is just that red external surface shown on the far left in red? So that's the composite panel, and the external surface is just the far left. Mm-hmm. Is it that the external surface in option 2 does extend around the bottom, say, of composite panels, or the top of them, if there's an opening? Or does the external surface extend, as in option 3, all the way around the panel? Can you help us as to what your understanding was?
I'll try, and I'll try to be succinct, though it's not even a simple question. It does come with a complex answer, I'm afraid. So there's a limitation imposed in terms of the test methods. Let's start with that. So where, picking on diagram 40, makes reference to external surfaces needing to be class O or class B, if you go down the national route, then pretty much by definition you are restricted to option 1 as well. You're restricted to option 1 as it applies to the external surface, because the test methods preclude assessment of what is going on at the edge of the test specimen.
Yes.
But you would, where there is a need for the cavity surface to be class O, you'd repeat the test on the back face.
Back face.
But you would not fundamentally understand what's going on at the edge of those panels.
Right. And what about the European test B, for classification B? That doesn't necessarily only test the surface, does it? It could be a mounted riveted panel or a cassette on a substrate with exposed edges, yes? Agreed,
yes. And in that instance, you're actually somewhat going beyond option 3, wherein the method of exposure, particularly with the single burning item test, the BSEN 13823 test.
Yes.
That leads to exposure of the front face, the exposed face, what is going on at the junctions, the back face potentially, and indeed, if your test specimen requires a cavity and your substrate needs to be representative, you may end up exposing that representative substrate as well. Right.
So are you saying that depending on which route to compliance you go down in diagram 40, national class naught or class B, depending on which route you go down, the definition of external surface changes? Is that your evidence?
It's not my evidence as to what the external surface of a building actually is, but in terms of the way the guidance in approved document B addresses the external surface,
yes,
and the surface provisions, then yes, that is my evidence.
Okay, thank you. One final question. Looking back, and we've gone through a lot in the last 2 days, what would you have done differently if you had the chance to do it?
So I've obviously taken time to reflect on things, not least post the fire itself, and having witnessed firsthand what happened. So what's done is done to a large extent, and you know, I've worked within these various constraints, and obviously I've had to set them out in my statements and in my evidence. But it's difficult to see how I would be where I am if I had acted differently. You know, we've been talking about simply refusing to do things. For what it's worth, going forward, I have reached a conclusion that I'm fundamentally not prepared to be beholden to a particular employer or client, or to work within those sorts of constraints, that I'm going to be wholly independent going forward, and that's the ethos that we've had in the company since it was formed. Because as has become clear to me, there are potential weaknesses to be had when you think you're working alongside colleagues, but you don't necessarily understand all of what is going on, or the information that you ought to be privy to.
I see. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, it just now comes to me to thank Dr. Crowder for the last 2 days, and I'm very sorry we've had to sit late tonight, but I'm very grateful for you giving us your answers. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Crowder, it's right that I should thank you on behalf of all members of the panel for coming along and giving us 2 days of your, no doubt, valuable time to tell us what you know about all these things, and it has been really helpful to us to hear from you. I'm sorry it's gone on longer than you might have wished this afternoon, but I think you prefer that to coming back on Monday.
Yes, indeed.
So the exercise is over, you're free to go, and you go with our thanks. Thank you very much indeed. And before we finally rise, I'd just like to say thank you to the stenographer and the document manager, who also have been kept later than usual, and no doubt at inconvenience to them as well. So thank you both very much indeed.
Yes, thank you.
Ms. Grange, thank you for today's evidence. We are now finished for this week.
Yep.
And we shall resume on Monday morning at 10 o'clock when there will be another witness.
Yes, we have Dr. Sarah Colwell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock on Monday, please. Thank you.